Welcome back to Markets Today. I'm your host, Mbithe Mwema. If you're just joining us, today we're doing a deep dive in the education sector. Yesterday, the Cabinet Secretary of the Ministry of Education announced that the schools will remain closed for the rest of the year. The school term will resume next year, that is January the year 2021. This affects the primary schools as well as the secondary schools, private schools as well as the public sector. Prior to this decision, the schools had been closed for about 3 months, but then the education sector had been very innovative and started facilitating online learning, either through the internet or through a mobile-based platform. Is this going to be the trend for the next 6 months, or what will happen? Because the education sector had certainly made huge investments. What does all of this mean for investments in this sector, and what should we be looking out for, and where are we coming from? This is a conversation that our guest in studio will be shedding light towards. Ms. Penina Mwangi is the MD of Spotify Ed. She's here with us to talk about the education sector, being a stakeholder in the sector. Welcome to the show, Penina.
Thank you.
What do you make of what's happening in this sector and the decisions that were made yesterday?
I can completely understand the safety of our children is absolutely paramount. We do also have to think about the ramifications of what this means, both from an economic perspective and a social perspective. Schooling was 5.5% of government GDP expenditure, and that's no longer going into the economy. Then if you think about it from a social perspective, children no longer are able to see and play with their friends. What are these interactions doing to them? As well as what is happening in terms of continued learning. So a lot of parents are now dismissive of continuing to learn throughout this year, because why would you pay to learn the same content twice? So that's really affecting a lot of institutions in Kenya.
Okay, I like that you're saying it's 5.5% of the GDP, and there's a lot of impact in terms of the number of people who are being affected by this. Now, the education sector has been paramount. We've seen a lot of funds getting into the private space, but then the funding has been going to funding structures, so to speak, because there are fixed costs that are affiliated with any education system. What does this mean now if you're out of business for almost a year, because that's effectively 9 months, call it a year? What has this meant, especially for the private stakeholders in the education space?
Actually, it's really tough. Like, if I can quote verbatim, a number of schools that we work with for our application literally send me a message saying, how do we survive? That's an entire year without income. You still have, exactly as you said, your fixed assets that you do have to pay for. You still have to service loans from the bank. You do have teachers, you have payroll to meet as well. So what sort of avenues do they have to meet any of these expenditures? I haven't had the government talking about that.
Okay, interesting. But just before we get back into the fixed expenditure, as well as how the investors are going to make it through, what does your company do? What role do you play in the education sector?
So my company, Spotify Learning, is actually a school management app. So we help schools manage all of their administrative and learning functions. And the reason for this is because we understood that there are critical aspects of the process of education, such as managing your student database, managing your finances, attendance, what exactly your teachers are doing, that actually impact the quality of education schools are able to offer. And so we provide schools with a tool that makes this entire process easy, efficient, transparent, and holds everybody accountable.
Okay, and I suppose this was doing well before COVID, or?
Yes.
Okay, for obvious reasons.
Yes. So we actually launched last year in May, and we've signed up about 30 schools so far. We have 5,000 subscribers. And so even pre-COVID, schools were already looking for systems that they could use to help them manage their daily administrative and learning functions. So what COVID has done is definitely highlight the need for ad hoc systems that you need to have in place. For instance, how do you communicate effectively with your parents when they're at home? Our application does help with that. Right now, what I would say is that during COVID, a lot of teachers and parents have been looking for content, and that's why we've seen a lot of investment go to in the first 2 quarters of the year. I would say the next 2 quarters would be quite interesting to see what happens, because now people are actually not as willing to pay for content as well. So it's quite a dynamic space we're in right now.
Okay, interesting. So I think for you it just means maybe for this year the scalability is sort of muted because the schools are not there up until next year. Is that the right way to look at it?
I think so. So what we're doing in terms of growing our business, just business development, A lot of schools aren't able to actually implement tools right now because, again, they just don't have the capital or human resources in place in order to bring on any sort of new technology or actually anything, in fact, for the next couple of months. So schools are effectively closed, which is something that we also really need to consider, what that will have an effect on, students' emotional, psychosocial outcomes as well.
Okay, interesting. So now another 6 months and you're talking about content, and you have said that for the first couple of months, 6 months to be exact, the content was focused on how do we move from the physical space and move this online and then create platforms. I know people have used Zoom, they've used WhatsApp, there's been SMS learning through USSD based learning as well. What happens now, 6 months, and all these people have made investments? Yes. It's very expensive to get content from physical to online and to distribute it. What happens to that investment, and what happens now for the next 6 months? I know it's a bit too soon to think about it, but when you're in that space, and maybe just from the interactions that you've had yesterday and today, how do we absorb this and not have it kill the private members of the education sector, but enable them to move forward?
Agreed. So actually, I think there's a huge misconception towards the level of content that was also being purchased. A lot of people assumed that the middle class was doing very well because they already have access to technology and access to an internet. However, what we've seen is that predominantly most schools had already closed down effectively since early June. So children have already not been learning for a significant period of time. Even though there's a lot of content that's being produced right now, what we actually have to think about is, what is the quality of this content? Has it been KICD approved? What metrics are we using to actually figure out, have students learned this content? And then what sort of progress reports can we have to actually show us that they've done well and actually understood this information? That's important. But then again, now going forward, if students are going to repeat this year, what incentive do they have to relearn the information?
That's very interesting, because you're effectively saying a couple of things. Is the content relevant? And then you're also bringing out a very interesting perspective in terms of the misconception of the middle class, because the whole conversation has been there's internet access, we are all using either Wi-Fi or data, but how is it that we have misconceived this opportunity in the middle class? Kindly elaborate on this.
I think that perhaps a lot of policyholders aren't in as adept to physically understand what's going on the ground. You know the Kenyan saying, "Vitu kwa ground ni different." That's exactly what we have seen. So if you look at the vast majority of schools that we're in Eastlands, they had already shut down effectively because parents were unable to pay fees. So then schools were not able to support teachers to provide them with content or mock content that their children had done already.
Okay, and what was happening? So if you're typically paying, say, X thousands during a normal term, how did it shift in terms of, I will help you do the same in your home? Did the prices for learning come up by 50%? Did they drop by 20? Did they drop by 30? Did the parents say that we're just not seeing value, or because of COVID, as a consequence, we just can't be able to afford to facilitate this?
Yeah, so you will see different reactions throughout the market. I mean, of course, we saw what's happened in the high end with a sort of institution such as Brookhouse insisting on 100% tuition payment at the high end of the market. Towards the middle market, actually schools were asking for less than 10% of fees in order for them just to afford to pay their teachers something that they can continue marking that content. And most parents just were unable to make that payment. So if it's a question between putting food on the table or having your kid learn, you're going to feed your kid first.
Wow, so feed your kid literally food, but not mental food, because it's not necessary. Okay, then yesterday happens and we are told what you've been doing for the last 3 months, thank you, it's irrelevant. And I know there's a lot of bitterness around, why didn't you tell us this 3 months ago? Why didn't you just take a hard decision then? I mean, there are moving parts and we can spend the day debating on whether it was the right decision or not. But the fact is, the decision has been made. No more schooling for the next 6 months. So what if now you're in the investment sector? What happens now? What do you do to stay alive?
I mean, we in the startup world have to now think about our burn rates and think about the longevity of the business. So there are different ways that you can create different partnerships to expand your reach throughout the market. But then, of course, you also have to realize that your profitability is definitely going to be impacted by this move.
Okay, but then for you, if you're saying you had 30 schools and possibly 5,000 people in your community, is there then an opportunity for you and stakeholders in that space to maybe partner and come up with content and price it in a different way? And is there an opportunity, or could there possibly be demand from the students from content that's not necessarily affiliated to education, but then you can pay as you go along? Is that maybe something that could morph into for the next 6 months or something?
I think so. I think also parents are really struggling with this decision. Your kids have already been home for a number of months and now they're home for the rest of the year. You know how African households don't like to see their children being idle. So there's definitely a market opportunity for that as well. Just to think about, I think what would be really great is to see student-centered content coming about. So what do students want to learn outside of what they're learning in the classroom, and also how do they want to learn it? Perhaps it's not just the content being regurgitated to them by a teacher, perhaps more interactive content, maybe content from other students themselves. So I think it's really a time for us in the education space to focus more on what the students need, what they want, and also what the market will look for post-COVID.
Okay, so if you're in technology and you're also in education, does your operation, or are there spaces in the technology space that say, hold on, we don't want to hear the parents? Can we use the same mechanism to actually go and reach out to the learner and understand what do they want to do? Is that something that can be made? Because you have a management system, but then the management system was focusing on the school and meeting the school need. Is there a chance that the same modality can be reconfigured and says, instead of the school, because now there's no demand for the school for the next 6 months, is it easy to just sort of turn direction and then now decide maybe the 5,000 users in your community are the respondents and users of that platform?
Exactly. I mean, we need to reconsider what is education. So education is about this transfer of knowledge, but does it have to take place in a physical institution called a school? And if not, then where can it take place? So it can be through play, it can be through so many variety of different teaching methodologies. I think also something that's critical for us to look at this juncture is different pedagogies. So we've been using set metrics throughout teaching, and now is the time for us to really explore what it is that we can do differently and what the impact of that could be. So a lot of monitoring and evaluation should also be in this space, and again that boils down to us and our management tools.
Okay, and what about engagement now with the policy holders? Because you're saying the policy holders are making these decisions more or less in isolation. It's nothing different from each and every sector. But then how do you then get them, or get an institution like KCDI or the Ministry of Education to partner with the stakeholders and to listen and to act on that information? Is that a space that is actively engaging? Do we have a policy state where the policy holders engage with the stakeholders and try and find out now what next?
I think we also, as a stakeholders, do have a responsibility to reach out to government. For a lot of times it's difficult for them to know who is actually in the market, who has an ear to the ground, where is this knowledge coming from. So I think that we can collectively do that, and I think that the fintech space did that quite well. The lending, they created their own council and then were giving recommendations to policymakers, and I think that there is room for that as well in the education space.
Okay, so we hopefully will see you back here as the chairperson of the association. very soon. We can't wait to hear what happens with that association. But let's paint a picture, because I'm trying to get us to the space of, okay, there have been continuous investments in education, and when you invest in education, in whatever capacity, it's sort of an annuity, because year in, year out, it's coming. Children are being born. Almost, I mean, the majority of the Kenyan population is below 19 years of age. So you're always, every year, there will be people who are coming to school. But then COVID has shown us, yes, it will be an annuity, but then there is a bump in the road. So then how do you actually manage the fluctuation of the cash flows. Holding that in mind, if there was the creation of an association of people in the fintech or stakeholders in the education system, and perhaps you were chairing it, or at least you're championing that cause. Today, if you start with the policymakers, what would be an ask, or what would be a need that you're presenting as a challenge that you would need the government's help to be able to address?
I think particularly in this year would be, I know they'd already talked about banks refinancing a lot of their debt and assets, but there should also be a commitment to provide support to the education sector, be it through subsidized loans or be it through subsidized resources in the future. So for instance, when they had the laptop program that was coming into place, had that been affected then, that would have really changed our current paradigm. So it could be in terms of resources, it could also be in terms of actual cash injection.
What, do you have a sense of how much cash the industry would need? I know I'm really jumping in the dark here.
So if you're talking about the private sector, they collect about $6.6 billion worth of tuition a year. So that is a significant impact on the economy from all of us who are in the tech space to basic suppliers who are supplying schools with food, mattresses, water, even utilities, government collecting less in terms of taxes. So there's a lot that's been impacted.
Okay. So that affects the taxes, which means we'll continue to have consumption tax as we go along. I mean, it's a very broad conversation, and I think because the changes that have just happened overnight, so it's been a very limited time in terms of trying to dissect and understand what next. But when you're trying to figure out 6 months, then 18 months from today, I know a part of your business model remains as is, because at some point all this ends and you continue. But how do you envision, how do you visualize? Is there any silver lining out of all this chaos and all this madness that you can say, perhaps there's a different way of looking at it and there could be some light at the end of the tunnel, but then this is really the opportunity that I see in this space?
I think that for us, what it has validated is that there is a need to have these systems in place, because whether you're thinking about online learning or if you're thinking about learning through radio that's been happening in the lower sector, how are people actually using systems to ensure that kids did consume this content and that we create reports for that? So pre-COVID, post-COVID, I think what's really important in the education space is think about what is education and is it actually taking place? Because when you go to a lot of schools and you ask them, what did they learn last week? What did they learn, 2 weeks ago? What did the teacher teach? Was that in line with the teaching plan? And not having the answers to this question fundamentally makes me wonder, are you actually providing your students with an education? So you do need these management policies in place, and there should also be on a national level where they should be able to track all of this information as well.
Okay, and you bring out also something very interesting. I'm in the media space and I'm very new to this. I'm just 1 year old. But I find that the skills that I have accumulated for the last 15 years in my career, especially now with COVID, it's like poof, they're all up there. And I'm finding myself forcing myself to have to start learning other skills. And it's not soft skills, it's really computer skills affiliated to the fourth industrial generation. How do I, if we record this, how can I cut it into bits and pieces and put it out there? Those technology affiliated skills, actually those are the things that are helping people survive in this space. Now when you look at the existing curriculum, you're in the you're in the fintech space, you're in the technology space, and then you're also cutting across in terms of providing a service to the education sector. I want to assume that you're also trying to, integrate the fourth industrial revolution and see how do we bring that ideology into the education space.
Right.
So when you look at it today, is there 1 or 2 things that we can actually do in spite of COVID to say, perhaps what we've been doing has not been right? Maybe after COVID, there's an opportunity to amend, if not by 5, maybe 10%, to ensure that these children in 5 years, in 10 years, are prepared for the new world that we're getting into. And I ask this in light of what you've just said. You say, through your monitoring and evaluation system, it's like people are just going through the race and you're like, when you're done, you're like, what did you do? Not sure, but I'm here, what next?
Yes.
So how do we how do we actually use this crisis to sort of shift our mindset as a stakeholder in that space to ensure that come 10 years, 20 years, we're in a different space?
Absolutely. So I think already I do have to commend Kenya for already shifting from the 844 to the CBC system. And as we see that being implemented further, it's only up to grade 3 as of today. But it's completely different. It's more robust. It requires more from parents to parental involvement as well. So that shift, that mindset, we are already there.
You're already there. Okay.
I think also then in terms of as a curriculum is still being built, because it is an iterative process based on what is happening in the market, I think we definitely do have to think about what are future job prospects like, and are we providing our children with the right skill sets to meet them. That's what we really need to be looking at.
So the future job market. So for instance, if you're talking about the future job market and skills, and you're speaking to somebody who's what, 12 years of age, and now they have 6 months where they can't be bothered about English, Swahili, maths, or whatever.
Yeah.
What's the 1 or 2 things you tell them that you need to do this so that when you're 24,
I sounds like so far.
It sounds like so far till you're 24
Yeah.
and it's 50,
Yeah.
So when you're 24, when you're
Right.
18, okay, let's do 18 in 6 years. So you're telling this 12-year-old child, I'm in this space, I'm a stakeholder in this space. I have an interest in technology because that's what drives my business. What would you tell such a child, a boy or a girl, 12 years of age, I think that's class 6 or 7, so that in 18 years, you're telling them if you do this, then you'll have a skill set, or you'll probably be better placed to engage in the world of 6 years from today.
Yeah. I think first the issue is, why are our children not engaging in the content? Why are they not excited to learn math and English? That should be an onus on us, that we're not presenting it to them in the way that they need it to be presented to them, because you should be able to excite them and ignite that passion for knowledge. So if you're not doing that, that's already a problem. Beyond that, I think we don't actually know what a lot of the jobs will look like in the future. A lot of jobs don't even exist today that these children will be going into. So what skills do they need to have? Critical thinking skills. I'm not a techie by profession, but I did build an edtech platform. So are we...
Oh, what's your background?
It's finance.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, to be discussed. All right.
Yeah, so you don't necessarily have to have a certain skill set, just can you think through and see a problem that you relate with, and then can you build a solution for that?
Okay, so that's critical thinking.
Yeah.
Is there maybe 1 or 2 others that you think would be important?
Oh, I think emotional intelligence is highest on my list. So if you're able to be attuned with what people need, which is then a market desire, then you're able to build a product based on that. And then of course, once you've created a product, then it's always an iterative process. So you always have to get feedback. So you're able to internalize and read through what your consumers are telling you so that you can keep improving your product offering.
Okay, fantastic. We take a short break there, Penina. When we come back, we sort of round up this conversation and say, this is where we're at. What next? Because we can either spend the time here arguing and say that the decision by the Cabinet Secretary to close schools was wrong, but effectively it's perfectly in order for you to have your child with you than having to deal with the extreme of having your child in a casket. Now that your child has come back to you, a precious gift and a blessing to you, question is, what can you do for the next 6 months? How can you engage with the education industry? And what opportunities are there for investments, at least in the short term, for us to be able to create a new way of thinking for the children and for the sector as a whole? We take a short break. Engage with us. Our SMS line is 20146. We are always available on our social media platforms, either as Metropole TV Kenya or as always as Mbithe Mwema. See you in a few.